Will this turn out great? Yes. Yes, it will. I'm building myself a desktop from hickory, walnut, and a color gradient using hexagonal wood tiles and a basic tessellation. Starting with 6 feet of thick-cut walnut and 9 feet of thick-cut hickory, I do a bit of planning. I won't bore you with all the math, but this seems like enough wood to make all the tiles and have a bit left over. I have not made a project like this before, and as such, some things will go smoothly, and no doubt I will get to learn something too. Initially, I cut my raw slab lumber into 2-foot sections, as I think I can get 3 hexagons out of each section. Even as the wood is stacked up here, you can see that my boards still have live edges and have some cupping. They are definitely not flat. Using the table saw, I rip the rough edges off, then plane each board on both sides so it's flat-ish. I know that I will need to plane these again after resawing, so there's no need for perfection at this point, just a mostly flat surface to make resawing safer and more predictable. So, I had to stop and build myself an outfeed table. With the length of these boards, about 2 feet, and the thickness of these boards, about 2 inches, and the amount of resawing that I need to do to cut this into about 5/8 inch thick planks, I had far too much resawing to reasonably ask my wife to stand over here and help me pull these boards out safely. So this is probably something I needed to do anyway, and something lots and lots of bandsaw users do. This is not the fanciest outfeed table ever, not by a long shot here. However, it was completely free. It was all from stuff and scraps that I already had. I built it so this rail is going to stay on here full time, but this piece I can go ahead and take off if I wish, as I was not able to integrate the miter slots into the outfeed table. So if I'm using a different kind of jig to support things differently when I'm, say, resawing a log for the first time, the miter slots there, it's not going to work. So I'll have to take it off, but that's okay. I'm consciously choosing to wear gloves here. Protecting my hands from the heavy, rough boards with splintery edges seems like good risk management. If you get too close to a bandsaw, it will of course cut the glove and your hand, but they are not known for pulling in the glove the way other tools might. You won't see me wearing gloves for miter or table saw work. Okay, my first round of resawing is done. That is far and away the most resawing that I've ever done before. As you may know, this is a new bandsaw to me, and it's got a new blade, and while this is not a bandsaw or blade review video, the bandsaw did not struggle cutting through 8 inches of walnut or 8 inches of hickory. I set it to cut slices that were about 5/8 of an inch thick, and it's probably not that difficult to see that these are not the same thickness. That is, I think, most likely going to be chalked up to user error, and that's okay. I tried to cut these a little bit thick, knowing that I was not perfect just yet, and may never be, and that I was going to plane them kind of all flat down to a 1/2 inch anyway, and that I cut probably a little bit more than I needed. So I'm going to do some planing, and I'm going to see how it works out. Another round of planing brought my boards down to 1/2 inch thick and pretty well flat. I am ready to use my hexagon cutting jig. There are several videos about hexagon cutting jigs. The one I used to make mine was from DIY Montreal, so thank you to her. It was the right balance of functional and fancy for me. A word about cutting hexagons. If your table saw or miter gauge has any setup flaws, it will expose them. Even a 1/16 of an inch or a 1-degree flaw will get magnified around all 6 sides and obviously show. My saw, having recently been in a moving container that had a rough ride, had to be tuned up for my jig to work properly. I did wear both of these things the whole time. It turns out that if you're using a thin kerf ripping blade to do a great deal of cross-cutting on walnut, which is kind of hard, and hickory, which is very hard, it just blows dust everywhere the whole time. So I enjoyed a bit of extra protection, and there's nothing wrong with that. some of this worked exactly the way I thought it was going to, and some of it did not. My hexagon cutting jig worked really well. My hexagons are identical. It was fairly easy to use. However, either it was a little too deep going this way, or perhaps my table saw isn't quite deep enough. This is a Delta hybrid, if any of you are table saw nerds out there. And had this been 4 or 5 inches longer, then the sled would have not wanted to kind of tip off the back with some frequency. So it was a little bit fussier than I thought to use it. Something else that did not go quite as expected was this plan I have. You might remember this from several minutes ago. That is not the way this worked out. If I put this on my CNC machine and asked it to cut 3 perfect hexagons out of there, then I could get 3 hexagons out of a piece of wood this size. But that is not actually what happened. As it turns out, I could only get 2. I hadn't necessarily planned for this, but it did turn out that I have plenty of wood, because this being 2 1/4 thick and me trying to make pieces that are a 1/2 inch thick meant that I did have an extra board that was still the right thickness out of each plank, so I didn't actually use all of the wood that you originally saw. So even though my planning wasn't quite perfect, things didn't get too messed up in that respect. But of course, getting only 2 7-inch hexagons out of a 22-inch board, I had a lot of scraps. More than I anticipated. I've got 17 hickory hexagons and 11 walnuts here, and I've also got these piles of different sized equilateral triangles that just sort of formed as I cut these. And I didn't cut every board the exact same way, because there were times where I was trying to cut around a knot or a piece of bark that I thought maybe wasn't quite as attractive or maybe structurally unstable. But anyway, it produced this pattern of equilateral triangles, sort of big, medium, small, which I had not anticipated. And I've got a whole other pile of scraps in which there are already a couple of 60-degree angles in it, and I could cut one more and I could add to these piles. So I've got a couple dozen perfectly cut equilateral triangles, which I will think of what to do with that. That's a bit of a happy accident, I think is the phrase. So that took me several hours, and it made quite a mess, but it is done, and once the sled was constructed accurately and the table saw was flawlessly set up, which did take me a while, then this process went really well. So I will see you perhaps tomorrow or the next day for the next phase of this project. My hexagons will sit on a 3/4 inch plywood base with a decorative walnut edge I constructed around it. Why plywood? Several reasons. It's stiff and strong to resist bending, readily available, flat from the factory, and it resists seasonal changes in temperature and humidity due to its cross-grain construction. So I shouldn't need to worry about seasonal expansion and contraction like you can get with a large slab of wood or even planks. Large slabs of wood are beautiful, but also rare and costly. I'd rather be a bit more creative with smaller pieces of wood and add color and pattern to them to create interest and beauty, not just buy the largest thing someone could chop down. Using 3/16 tile spacers, I laid out my hexagons in the pattern I planned and glued them down with standard wood glue. It was slow going. I could glue 3 down, and then I needed to wait a couple of hours for the glue to set to use the tile spacers for the next 3 without the first 3 shifting. Despite my maniacal measuring, I do have little bits of hexagon hanging over my decorative edge, so that will need to be cleaned up on the table saw. So in order to rip a 1/16 off of this edge of the desktop and have it be perfectly parallel, I have to make sure that the part of the desk that is running along the fence here is parallel. And as you can visually see, especially with this first one right here, that one's sticking out a 1/16 of an inch, definitely a little bit more than I would like. So I put this oak spacer board in here as a perfectly parallel piece, so the fence is touching the oak spacer board, and then it's running along the bottom structural part of this desk, so that way this edge that is flawed at the moment isn't the one running along the fence. So I should be able to rip one side, flip it over. I probably won't need the oak spacer for the second one, rip the other side off, and I've only taken a tiny bit off. I should have two perfectly parallel edges that are flawlessly flat. That is the goal. That worked. Next, I made a couple of pieces for the long edges of the desk. They are also walnut, and I cut the corners to the same 60-degree angle as the corner hexagons, so it matches. This edge has two purposes. First, to hide the transition between the structure below and the decorative top, and second, to seal up two sides in preparation for resin being poured. After nailing them on, I'm ready to start pouring resin. In further preparation for resin pouring, I put down a couple of thin scraps to protect the table saw in case of resin leakage and ensure the surface is as flat as I can possibly make it. I use silicone earplugs to stop up the open ends of both sides. This turns out to be mostly successful, only a little resin leaked out. With the first resin pour, I am filling in the tiny voids and insect holes in the hexagon and creating a base layer to seal the bottom. I know that resin will seep into and under any void or gap between the plywood and the hexagons. This layer will also further bond the hexagons in place. These sticks represent my planning for my color gradient, purple to blue to green to yellow. So I'll be using 4 main colors with a transitional color between each, for a total of 7 shades. I cannot mix and pour all 7 colors at the same time, so I need a way to make a temporary but removable resin dam between shades. So this small stick wrapped in a thin sheet of silicone earplug is my first attempt at this. I pour the colors at opposite ends of the desktop and my color gradient, purple and yellow. There was a little leakage with resin dam method number 1, and the silicone had to be dug out with the head end of a nail. I did eventually get it all out, but I'll try another method. Method 2 is a strip of silicone mat jam fit between hexagons with a couple of craft sticks. This is for chartreuse, a transition color. There was minor leakage at the bottom of my silicone strip dam. The strip came out easily, but the craft sticks were epoxied in from the leakage at the bottom. This pair of sticks took quite a while to carefully chisel out. I'll have to try another method. Attempt 3 was a tightly rolled strip of silicone mat jam fit between hexagons. This still produces minor leakage at the bottom, but was easily removed afterwards. I think it's my winner for now. So after all the resin pouring and waiting 5 full days for everything to cure as hard as it's going to, this is what I've got. As far as the color distribution goes, I think it looks great. But of course, this resin table, like all resin tables look at this stage, of course is a splotchy mess. It turns out it's actually not that easy to pour resin over and over in a crack that's only 3/16 of an inch wide, while getting the color fade effect that I'm pretty sure I have achieved pretty well. So I have a lot of sanding ahead of me. At this point, in a lot of videos, you would see me take this table to my quote buddy's shop, who has a planer that costs anywhere between $25,000 and $50,000 that will plane off a couple of 16ths worths of this and clean it up very, very quickly, but I do not have that. I do have an open-ended drum sander, and it is an awesome piece of equipment, but I know from experience, if I put this table in there now, that sandpaper is going to be clogged with nasty resin very, very quickly, and I'm going to use a ton of it. So instead, I'm going to use my 5-inch sander, and I'm going to get a lot of this resin off, and then I'm going to use this machine for the final flattening before coming back to a hand sander to make sure that I get this to a glass-like finish, which I will have in the end, but there's an awful lot of work in the meantime. So that's what I'm going to do. So here's where I am now. It took 90 minutes with a 5-inch disc sander and 150 grit paper to clean off all the excessive resin. It looks pretty good. My top is pretty flat, but I'd be fooling myself if I told me that I was a flawless sander and that it did not need to go through the drum sander a few times. So that's what I'm going to do next. Naturally, the finish on the resin is extremely dull at this point, but you can probably still see some of the color fade as I go from purple to cobalt to blue to green, chartreuse, yellow on the other side. Naturally, as this gets shinier and better finished, those colors will continue to pop more and more. So a couple of trips through the drum sander to flatten it out before I start the extensive sanding process in order to get this tabletop looking fabulous. After drum sanding to flatten it and random orbital sanding for a good finish, this is my desktop. It is dust-free, having been vacuumed, air compressor blasted, and mineral spirits wiped. I have chosen Rubio Monocoat for my finish, an oil-wax hybrid developed originally for use on floors. You can easily find a video, or 10 of them, just on this finish, so I'll not pontificate about it here. I apply it according to the directions, with the exception that my new silicone scraper turns out doesn't have an even edge, so I swap it for a lint-free shop towel on the fly. Before showing you the finished top, and it is glorious, I'll leave you with my final thoughts. Considering that this is tabletop number 1 I've made, based exclusively off my transferable woodworking and resin skills, I'd say this is excellent. There was no practice table. Naturally, this hound looks bored with her human's work. However, she does think that this video deserves a like and subscribe so you can see more unique projects like this, in addition to the usual fare of customized pet memorials and dog stories. Here is the finished desktop. Thanks for watching.